The Chinese call us separatists, but that is a false description. Once Tibet was independent from China. That's the plain truth. And if the world does not back this truth, then truth loses its meaning. Four Chinese held my arms and others kicked me in my back. They carried me away by car. Along the road, an old woman shouted, "They arrest our people." Then they kicked her too, and she fell. When I shouted, "Tibet is independent," I was not afraid at all. I just expressed a feeling that was hidden deep down in my heart. Look, behind this mountain is Tibet, my country.
This is northern India at the foot of the Himalayan mountains, the place where the 30-year-old nun Yangdol escaped to 10 years ago. She fled her homeland Tibet to evade Chinese rulers who occupied her country in 1949. The Chinese regard Tibet as a Chinese province, and they rule it with an iron fist. Thousands die, and hundreds of thousands fled the country. In this relief centre, new refugees from Tibet arrive every day. Most come on foot across the Himalaya mountains. On this morning, a girl is born here in the centre. The mother is exhausted. She fled across the mountains from Tibet while about to give birth. Yangdol welcomes the political refugees. Recently, some young nuns arrived after spending years in Chinese prisons. They tell of being tortured after they were arrested for demonstrating against Chinese rule.
One of our fellow inmates was tortured with a cattle prodder, an electrified stick that farmers use with their cattle. A stick with a high electric charge was put into her eyes. She could not see anymore and bumped into all kinds of things.
Tibet is completely under the control of Chinese security troops. The land is being reshaped into a Chinese province. Yangdol remembers how indoctrination began at an early stage.
At school, all books dealt with Chinese history and were written in the Chinese language. Most subjects were given in the Chinese language, not in Tibetan. That's how they want to change Tibet. At school, they taught us to honor Mao. They decided what we should learn. I decided there, this is not our language, but they forced it upon us. I told my parents, I want to leave school and I want to become a nun.
Yangdol became a nun in order to escape the burden of the Chinese yoke. However, China's influence is far-reaching. Monasteries were demolished and pictures of the Dalai Lama were forbidden. Everyone had to succumb to the Chinese state. Demonstrations were broken up with force. At the age of 17, on the anniversary of the Chinese Revolution, October 1st, 1991, Yangdol decided to demonstrate against Chinese oppression all alone.
There were many soldiers in the city center. I wore a red habit and a purple blouse. I went to the temple and said a prayer. When I was nearly finished, the army surrounded the temple. After doing my bows, I shouted, "Tibet is independent. The Chinese must go." Then I added, "Long live the Dalai Lama." Then I ran. But the police grabbed me by my clothes and dragged me away.
The Chinese arrested Yangdol solely for shouting slogans. In jail, she was so badly treated, she became seriously ill and was released early. Yangdol concluded that remaining in her homeland was no longer possible. The nuns saw no other option than to flee on foot across the Himalayas.
I did not fear dying in the mountains, but I feared that the Chinese would seize me before I could manage to flee Tibet. It was a journey full of dangers, especially if it started snowing. One mountain was covered with snow. We had to cross it the same night. If we failed, we would freeze to death. It was really tough.
The journey on foot took more than 2 weeks. At last, Yangdol reached Nepal. From there, she went to the town of Dharamsala in northern India, the residence of the Dalai Lama, who is the spiritual leader of the Tibetans. After his escape from Tibet, he installed a government in exile there.
How old are you? 18. How many family members do you have? 9, myself included.
Yangdol spoke to newly arrived refugees and wrote down stories about the persecutions in Tibet. This information was used by the Tibet Information Network, headed by the Dutchman Jan Wilhelm den Besten. He noted that nuns play a prominent role in the Tibetan resistance movement.
Nuns are women who possess a strong determination to express their Tibetan identity. And although young nuns often look very sweet and soft, they are tough people who hang on to their principles. So many times we experienced that these young women decided to go for it and testify what they truly believe in.
Om ervoor te gaan en om uiting te geven aan wat zij geloven, waar zij achter staan.
Is that also the case with Yangdol?
Dat geldt ook voor Yangdol. En het geldt zelfs.
Yes, I would say especially so. Nuns share many activities as to underline their unity and team spirit. Yangdol was one of the few in Tibet who took to the street all by herself, knowing the risks and consequences.
Nonnen in Tibet die alleen de straat op zijn gegaan, hoewel ze wist wat de consequenties waren.
These nuns, who recently arrived after having fled the Chinese, were detained in this jail for a number of years. This video was made in secret. Together with 5 other nuns, the nun Nidran was tortured for days at a time.
We were beaten up. They banged my head against the wall and used the cattle prodder. They used it in several ways. It can make you lose consciousness. It leaves no visible wounds, but internal damage is done in various ways. They remove your clothes and administer electric shocks under your arms and feet. They continue doing this until you confess.
Nidran ended up in hospital. Her 5 companions didn't survive being tortured. The Chinese claimed the nuns committed suicide.
It is important that we can talk about our suffering, but if we go back, we are afraid that they will seize us. But for the moment, we are happy to be united with the Dalai Lama. Whenever I hear such a heartbreaking story, I realize with how much courage these people risk their lives. Then I say to myself, how long will this last? When will truth prevail? When I ponder on these things, I am not able to sleep well. Then I feel pain everywhere. Then I feel miserable. I think of stories about children who die during the journey through the snow, and the prisoners that are being tortured. When I think of all that, I cannot sleep.
After these nuns were released from detention, the Chinese forbade them to re-enter their monastery. They decided to flee to India, where they hope once again to be able to practice their faith. Yangdol is writing a book containing protest songs written by detained nuns.
These nuns relate with this song. What distress they have in their hearts, they could tell no one. In prisons, they were being tortured. That's what they sing about. For fear others would hear their songs, the Chinese punished them even more severely. One of the girls was held in solitary confinement for more than a year in a very small square cell meant for those with a long jail term. That's what they sing about.
The information that Yangdol and her colleagues have collected from the refugees is being passed on to organisations like Amnesty International and the United Nations. Regretfully, little is done with these shocking testimonies.
Now I live in India. In Tibet, I assumed that all Westerners would support our case. I believe they were honest people. But in India, I saw to my dismay that financial interests prevailed. Tibet's fate does not count. Truth is out of the picture.
Until now, resistance against the Chinese has seen very little violence. However, Yangdol doubts this will last if there is no rapid improvement in the situation of the Tibetans.
After all these years, people lose their patience. After half a century of occupation, they feel they have nothing to say whatsoever. For us, Tibetan Buddhists, it is one of our aims to remain tolerant. But we are no more than simple human beings. Almost all Tibetans desire independence, but we are following the compromise solution that is suggested by the Dalai Lama. But the Chinese refuse to accept his idea too. Then people do not bother any longer to put their lives at stake and resort to taking action. I miss my home. But however much I miss it, it lacks freedom. Sometimes I consider going home, but when I think of the occupation, I get disheartened again. It is hard to keep in a positive mood. I help where I can and work at the top of my ability, hoping that I can mean a lot to many people and help them out of their plight and their misery. My ambition is to tell the world the story of Tibet. That is my mission. They